Hi, everyone. Welcome and thank you for attending this week's webinar. I'm Nina Dallas Alice, a Senior Associate at M&A Associates, Inc., or M&A. We are building on last week's introduction to culturally responsive evaluation framework and practices to discuss more of the practices themselves this afternoon. Next slide, please. So if you're new or returning, please take a moment to introduce yourself and post your question in the chat. We'll dive into those questions during the Q&A portion of today's webinar after the presentation. Next slide, please. Before we begin, let me quickly go over a few housekeeping items that you see before you. And I just want to really highlight a few. First, if you're just joining us in this webinar, welcome again. And please introduce yourself and post your questions, which we'll address during the Q&A. Second, we have live closed captioning, as you see here, and that's thanks to Heather. Third, if for any reason you run into any technical issues, please contact our colleagues, especially our AAAS colleague Jamila Blake at jblake@AAS.org. She will gladly help you troubleshoot. Fourth, a link to the slides available in the chat, and please note that we'll be using our chat for communication purposes and also as a resource, so please don't forget to save the chat when you leave. And also, please take a look, and at the end, we will have a survey, and we really request you to complete that. All our webinars are through your valuable feedback, and so please take a moment to complete that. Next slide, please. So it is important for me to share a few disclaimers with you. This material is based upon work supported by the National Science Foundation under grant number 2224093. Any opinions, findings, interpretations, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this material or those of its authors do not represent the views of the AAAS Board of Directors, the Council of AAAS, AAAS's membership, or the National Science Foundation. Additionally, the AAAS STEM Rec is promoting consultation with M&A Associates, Inc., as they are a rec partner. However, this does not constitute an endorsement of M&A Associates, Inc. as evaluators by the National Science Foundation. Next slide, please. If you missed last week's webinar, the slides and recordings are now available, and you can find that link, or I should say their links, in the chat. Next slide, please. And now, without further ado, I'm turning things over to our presenter, Dr. Katrina Bledsoe. Dr. Bledsoe?
Hi, everybody. Good to see everyone. Well, some I can see, some I can't. But, oops, my apologies. I clicked on the wrong thing here. So let me go back to my slide deck here. Okay. So, sorry about that. But just had a slight thing there. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Having a little problem. Okay, now we're back. All right, so today is the second group or the second part of culturally responsive evaluation, applying culturally responsive evaluation in practice to your STEM project. So I know we're doing this in a quick version. It takes a little bit of time, but wanted to give you as much as I can, just a little bit of something to chew on in terms of the practical aspect of culturally responsive evaluation. Because I always get, how do you do it? And you probably might find out that you're probably doing it quite a bit yourself. So just a really quick introduction of me. Again, I'm Katrina Bledsoe. I'm partner with Strategic Learning Partners for Innovation and an applied social psychologist and evaluator by training. And have just been I'm a generalist by background, but have specialized in culturally responsive evaluation for the last couple of decades. So, if in case you missed it, last week we actually did more of the theoretical piece of culture responsive evaluation, which sort of set us up a little bit in terms of the grounding of sort of a philosophical of science. And the reason I do that is because you kind of have to know what that is. I think in the past, a lot of folks struggled to figure out if there's actually been any theoretical grounding in CRE, and there has. So we found that evaluation as relationship centered. Context matters in a CRE evaluation. So people, place, history, socio-political, all of that has meaning. Reflexivity, which is understanding our positionality or how we approach and influence the evaluative setting. And then finally, using CRE to inform, not dictate evaluation design. So CRE is asking evaluation to sort of be able to inform it, but not be determined by the actual kinds of methods that you may want to use. So that's where we are. I'll just say what we're going to do today is we're more along the lines of moving from a stance, because I mentioned before in the last webinar that it's a stance, it's positionality, it's a perspective. So we're moving from stance to actual strategy. Hopefully there'll be some practical strategies for application that you can find here. And we have one STEM example via the case study from a recent STEM focused program that I'm going to try to link some of those suggestions too, and then any insights from the field. So I'm going to do a lot of talking, quite a bit, and the hope is that there's enough time for questions and comments. And again, one of the things that I really want to let people know is that it's likely you've been doing some of this. CRE is just good evaluation. I always like to say it's kind of like if you go to a party, don't you ask usually what you're going to wear, what's happening? Same thing here on a very sort of practical sense. So really quickly, just a refresher, the core elements of a CRE framework are it's grounded in context. You center participants' perspectives, so it's people-centered. It's inclusive and iterative data collection, so you're not in a one and done. In fact, you're in an iterative setting and you're trying to figure out how the data can continually inform what you're learning. And it's action-oriented learning as well. So just want to lay that there and then remind people what it looks like. Okay, so this is the CRE framework. I just want to say again that people usually say that makes sense. You know, you prepare for the evaluation, you engage stakeholders, you identify the purpose, frame the questions, design the evaluation, select and adapt, and collect the data and all of that stuff, and analyze and disseminate and use results. But it is but you'll notice that culture is throughout the entire framework, as well as you can tell that it's also iterative. And let me see, I just realized that my camera is off, so let me see if I can get that back on so that you can see me. All right. My apologies to everyone. So you see that framework, and as I mentioned before, for those of you who are here, is that not only is it iterative and sort of that circular space here is you can actually find sometimes that you may end up going back to different parts of that step-by-step process. So it's not unusual to go back from collecting data and realize that you have to re-identify the purpose of the evaluation. So just wanted to remind people of that framework. Okay, so one of the things I noticed that people really wanted was sort of to kind of pull something through all the way through, like what does it look like? We as researchers and evaluators, often we have a real set way of looking at research and evaluation, so we're not always sure what it looks like. Um, or if we're doing it, and then sometimes you find out that you've been doing it all along. So we're going to use a case here that starts with mentoring at an historically Black college and university, otherwise known as an HBCU. So here's the case that we're going to try to link with the CRE framework. So an evaluator working with an HBCU-based STEM program noticed that while retention rates were strong, students reported different mentoring experiences across STEM disciplines. By hosting scholar-led focus groups and including student mentors in evaluation planning, the evaluation surfaced discipline-specific mentoring gaps that weren't visible in survey data. This led to a new peer mentoring initiative designed by scholars themselves. Okay, so that's what we're going to use as I go through and talk about what we think it looks like. Okay, so I'm going to break it down by stage. And actually sort of like we're going to do 3 at a time, and then I'll just sort of break it down by stage. Now, stages 1 through 3, I have to admit, I sort of like fudge just a tiny bit here by saying that you'll notice that engaging stakeholders, even though we had it as one of the stages there, um, it actually occurs throughout the entire process. So we're just going to sort of keep that always in the space, but since we had it as a one of the stages, just wanted to mention that as well. So when we're talking about preparing for an evaluation, often when we think about it, we're going, okay, what type of activities do we want to use in a culturally responsive activities? Of course, we're going to be analyzing the context, and we do that in a lot of it. A lot of evaluations, but sometimes we don't do it quite as much as we want to. So informant interviews, group discussions, feedback sessions, that's really helpful. We have to consider communication style. So once you meet people, you have to figure out, well, how do they communicate? Who communicates by email? Who does it by text? Who does it non-verbally? Who goes to the meeting after the meeting? So you want to know about those kinds of things. Those things matter as we prep for the evaluation. Consensus on the purpose is a huge thing in terms of trying to gain trust. We want to figure out who really is invested in the evaluation and in the program itself. And then the kind of team that we want is we really want to, I would say those represented, I say multi-ethnic here, but it's really about who is represented of the entire population and communities that you're dealing with. And then spend time acquiring foundational knowledge. Because one of the things that you want to do is you want to know who's available. It helps to know the history of the organization, as well as it just helps to know sometimes it even helps to know the history of the city and how universities or groups are interacting with each other, and if there's been any type of issue between them. The process evaluation is we want to look at the program theory for cultural sensitivity. We also want to think about how appropriate are the program goals for the population. Often when we come in as evaluators, we say, listen, these are the program goals we're going to evaluate with that. But sometimes we have to ask the question of, are these actually the goals that that's for the population, and are these appropriate to evaluate? And then also trying to decide what how you're going to capture cultural nuances, or how are you going to look at examining correlates of participant outcomes. Some of those are all aspects that we need to sort of consider. I'm sort of going to really like punctuate this idea of capturing cultural nuances, because sometimes the way it's almost the same as, if you might say, people might say a word differently, and then it has a different inflection point. Similar here, similar issues here. So let's just sort of dig in, and I'll try to make that case connection. in terms of the goal. So we build cultural awareness and readiness for CRE. So that's the goal for preparation for the evaluation. Um, Here at this point, we're going to reflect on evaluator positionality, cultural lens. Who do we need on the team? What are some of the histories? Are there any issues between groups or communities, or are there any longstanding issues, or are there recent changes that have occurred? So those are sort of like what that looks like. Here's that going back to that case, the HBCU case. Evaluators spent time understanding the campus cultures and mentoring traditions at the HBCU and transfer experiences at the community college before designing tools. Because everybody knows if you're starting, if you start out like I did, you start as a transfer student, things change, even though you might be still going to a college in the same city or in the same area. And so those aspects, at least here, made for understanding and prepping for the evaluation. Engaging stakeholders, what it looks like, we're actually talking about like including scholars, mentors, faculty, advisors as co-evaluators. That is all helpful in being able to be able to understand what's happening. Now, I also just want to stop here and say really quickly that not all, if you can't go from 1 to 9, that doesn't mean don't do a culturally responsive evaluation. We understand that time, space, access prevent from doing some things. Doesn't mean that you shouldn't do some aspects. So you may spend a lot of time in a culturally responsive space where you're feeling like um weird, like trying to understand things just a little bit better, but we're going to spend a lot of time with stakeholders, but we're still going to use this particular design. We would rather err in the idea of trying to understand some of those cultural nuances rather than to do nothing at all and come up with data that's not reflective of what's happening. So just going back to engaging the scholars, how do we engage stakeholders? Well, you want to include scholars, mentors, everybody, and then CRE in action, which is convene inclusive advisory groups. We've all done that, but I want to make a case for doing it authentically and meaningful, and not just sort of like, hey, we're going to talk to you once a year and say that. But we're really talking about having people's perspectives um, really represented. Um, we want to value multiple forms of knowledge, and we also want to understand and recognize when there's power dynamics and try to create a safe space to nullify some of those. So the case connection here, going back to that HBCU case, that scholar-led focus groups at the HBCU and bilingual student-led forums. At the community college, they strengthen trust and ownership. There's something about having some level of ownership and of what kind of information is being said about you. And I know that certainly in a lot of communities I've worked with, that is exactly what the case is to actually maintain ownership. I always say that researchers and evaluators, we've been taught that when somebody lets go of the data and they give us that information, that it becomes ours, but it's not. That's not the case, and especially not in a CRE perspective. Okay, so if you're identifying the case identify the purpose for your STEM project, why does the evaluation matter to STEM or the local context? So you're still going to ask a why. I think evaluators tend to ask a what and a how, but in a CRE perspective, we're asking why. Why does the evaluation matter to the STEM community or the local context? And why does the program matter to the community and the local context? CRE in action, we want to make sure that the purpose aligns with the scholar and institutional goals. We want to clarify how the findings will be used and how they will benefit participants. Often, when we ask for help, we always say, well, it's not going to benefit you personally, but and we give them some sort of like, I like to say, very tepid response as to why they should be involved. But in a CRE perspective, you really want to link that to an overarching perspective that people can see themselves in, even if it doesn't necessarily affect them personally right away. And then we focus on improvement and responsiveness, not just accountability. So we're really talking about like, well, we don't want to just talk about accountability. We're also talking about like, well, how can we change? What can we actually bring to the forefront and really enhance? So going back to that case context connection here. So the purpose for the STEM working with HBCU was reframed from measuring retention to understanding mentoring experiences and belonging. That seems like a much more appropriate question, given that there were differing perspectives and differing experiences at mentoring, which some things may work in one particular space that aren't necessarily going to be great for retention. And in another, those same characteristics might also work. So you have to understand the mentoring experiences and the belonging rather than how are we talking about retention? And retention is probably a little bit downstream. So you're asking an upstream question rather than a downstream question. Okay. So that was stages 1 through 3. And you'll notice right over here, I've still got the engaging stakeholders never out of the process there. But for stages 4 through 6, we're talking about framing the questions, designing the evaluation, and selecting and adapting instruments. We definitely want to determine, when we're talking about framing the right questions, we want to determine the right type of questions, but the right type of evidence. And I like to say, what is credible evidence for folks? And having that discussion is a crucial one, because we know as evaluators, as researchers, that you can provide great evidence. All of it has meaning to us, but it doesn't necessarily all have meaning to everyone else. So we have to understand what has meaning to folks and what will they consider evidence that they can either enhance or make changes or spend time in the program with. So just wanted to make that clear. Critical question, critically question evaluation questions. One of the things I like to ask is how might different evaluation questions result in different understandings of the program? I think I might have said my kaleidoscope thing, and really to unpopular, contrary to popular belief, kaleidoscope still exists. But if you turn a kaleidoscope and that allows you to see like different beautiful colors, what might you get just by one turn? Similar, how might different evaluation questions result in different understandings of the program? And how might it lead to a different approach that you might take? I don't believe that any evaluation is just limited to one way of getting answers, and the CRE approach allows for multiple ways of doing that, especially when you're thinking about designing the evaluation and thinking about mixed methods. So mixed methods often yield the best results. Not that we're not making a case for or against, or particularly towards qualitative or quantitative, but what we are saying is that sort of from what they called it in graduate school, a critical multiplist perspective, which is every method brings its own biases or its own error. And the use of multiple methods often covers that error. It's also like a sort of a puzzle piece. You got one puzzle piece to the whole picture, but adding another puzzle piece allows you to see a better part of that. But on its own, it gives you just one piece of the puzzle. If you want to sort of like decide to adapt, develop existing measures, I am definitely for existing measures, adapting measures, creating measures. I will say probably over the years in CRE evaluations, I would say probably a good 60% of the time I end up adapting or creating new measures, simply because the context actually calls for it. And when you adapt measures, you're usually doing it in concert with key partners. And in this case, I say community here, but it could be your key stakeholders or your key partners are those who are the program administrators. But adapting measures in concert with them can help one, increase the ability to to get better response rates, and two, the fact that that they'll be on board with actually trying to um, collect that information. You also have to think about, as you're thinking about adapting instruments, your language, orientation, and my colleague, Dr. Rodney Hobson out of American University, talks about translanguaging, understanding how language plays out in different settings and what the meanings are. Um, Having rigorous translation processes, understanding the nuance of dialects. And I certainly have been in those situations where I have learned the hard way that dialects matter. And then also having folks review by a native speaker. Don't forget, don't go out on your own on that. But if you're able to get a review with folks, that helps as well. So let's see what it looks like. Framing the evaluation questions. Um, the goal is to co-construct evaluation questions that reflect local and cultural context. In this case, we're talking about the HBCU. The CRE in action is, what does success look like for scholars? And that might vary. Um, what you frame questions around assets and not deficits. Usually we're always asking what's missing, but it also helps to ask what is already there, what's had, what can we enhance? And then also using language that resonates with participants. Language has changed since the 25 years I've been doing evaluation, and you'd be amazed at what people respond to depending on either their generation, their region, just context. So let's go back to that HBCU and the case and the context connection here. So in this case, for that HBCU, trying to frame the right evaluation questions, transfer advisors and scholars co-developed their interview questions, uncover cultural and linguistic barriers to transfer and to have a better understanding of what the evaluation questions needed to be. So that's really helpful having those folks because they're in the process. They are actually living the day to day. So they would be the best folks to ask. So once you get to designing the evaluation, you want to choose methods that are participatory and culturally congruent. And when I mean culturally congruent, I mean whatever culture you're working in, they should be culturally congruent. And that might mean going beyond what I call the big five, which are, again, I think I mentioned this the last time: observations, document reviews, interviews, focus groups, and surveys. Not that those methods aren't great, but there may be some other methods that might be culturally more appropriate that yield more appropriate and more precise data. CRE in action, use narrative inquiry, focus groups, participatory design, any of those. It could be that you're using things that might be storytelling. Photo voice is a thing. I know Kavita and I have talked about photo voice a little bit and other aspects. So some of those things that are a little bit off the beaten path might be helpful in getting the kind of information that is useful and helpful. We also want to ensure accessibility in language and format, and we want to plan for iterative reflection and adaptation. So basically, as you're doing a CRE and honestly any evaluation, you have to plan for iteration, because one of the things that we really want to do is you want to have good data. And what's the use of not of like doing it once and having not great data, not telling you what you really what's really happening. The case studies, the case connection is the scholar-led focus groups at the HBCU shaped a new peer mentoring design based on shared narratives. So I think that that is helpful, and where that was something to look at. So select and adapt instrumentation. Use or adapt tools that honor scholars' cultural identities. Basically, it gets as simple as that. Translate instruments, and that's an action, or adapt for linguistic diversity. Validate measures with scholars, and trying to understand, make sure it has the right cultural fit, because what you think might be appropriate may not necessarily be. So starting there is a lot easier. And again, mixed methods to capture that holistic experience. Remember, mixed methods is a way to build on a puzzle piece, or excuse me, on a puzzle rather than just one individual piece. The case connection, back to our HBCU. So bilingual surveys and co-created interview guides helped surface nuanced experiences of belonging and advising. So this provided an opportunity for folks to sort of understand what is underneath all of that. So I think that sort of like lays that there, and I'm hoping that this is sort of giving you some ideas about what you're either already doing or can do. So these final stages are 7 through 9, collecting data, analyzing data, and you'll see with collecting data, we got qualitative, we got a whole list of things that are possible to do. Quantitative, of course, our surveys, our behavioral characteristics, and training people as instruments. Understanding nonverbal behaviors, videotaping and reviewing, knowing what's been said and knowing the language, especially as you're not only collecting the data, but also as you're analyzing the data and what interpretations look like. If you can bring people on to think about analyzing the data from your constituents and your partners, do. It's really helpful because they can explain some things that maybe you're not getting. Um, as well, disaggregation of variables. I know we like to combine variables, but sometimes we just have to really talk about what's happening at the individual level or at a specific group level. As far as results and dissemination, think about using multiple modalities, how you're going to visualize the data, how people hear data, or how people digest results and how they want to hear it disseminated. So you might be trying to think about multiple ways of actually getting out information to various partners. And then make sure that you've got a way for communities to review and think about what the results are. Sort of data viewing parties are often, those are becoming sort of the rage here, and I think they're really helpful. So just rounding the corner, collecting the data, gather the data through trust-centered, inclusive approaches. However people feel like they feel most comfortable is the way you probably should gather the data. Think about being bilingual and using community-led data collection strategies. You'll notice in the HBCU, we're having student-led bilingual forums fostered authentic participation and surfaced invisible transfer barriers. It is true. Many social psychological studies talk about the fact that we do often respond to those who are most like us. In analyzing the data, interpret the data collaboratively and contextually, and then include scholars and faculty and meaning making. So not just you going in the corner and making meaning out of it and the evaluation team, but actually having the scholars and the faculty making meaning out of it as well. Avoid deficit framing, triangulate findings using culturally relevant frameworks. So if you have just if you're working with a culturally relevant framework, maybe you're also working with a framework that comes from engineering or math. So don't be afraid to sort of mix and match and overlay as well. The case connection, going back to HBCUs, the evaluators worked with the mentors and the scholars to interpret focus group data, and they identified systemic mentoring gaps rather than individual shortcomings. So they were able to get to something that was much more systemic rather than deficit individual focused. Finally, disseminate and use the results, share findings in actionable ways. CRE in action, use bilingual or community-based dissemination formats. Create scholar voices, center them in presentations and reports. I know certainly in my own work, town halls have been great, being at the community town hall or maybe the student town hall and having sent scholar voices being there. The case connection, is at the HBCU case again, community college students presented results at a bilingual forum, leading to new transfer policy changes. So wherever you can provide uh, information and attend forums that can get information out, even if you're using social media as well, think about the ways that you do that. So I think I'm almost at time, but I know I presented quite a bit at this time here, and I was trying to get it across, but of course I believe these slides will also be available for folks to go back to looking at. But just wanted to say, and again, just wanted to let people know this is usually like a day-long workshop. So we're just trying to get in as much as we can. But just if you can tell me and go to menti.com, do you think you can conduct a CRE evaluation in STEM? And yeah, and the code is 64527201. And feel free to add comments to the chat as well. And we'll see what we have. So I'm going to get out of this and go to my Menti and see what's happening as soon as it lets me. Oops. All right, trying to get to the Menti without like getting me out of this entire thing here. So oops, apologies. All right, let's see. Okay, got a few folks who ever participated. Thank you for those folks. We said a CRE. We have an emphatic yes, yay, and I think so. Yes, I'm feeling good about that as well. I'll take it. Because as I was saying, is that I think this is an approach that often people feel like they can't do. Either I have to do it all or I'm not going to do any of it. And my my thought about that is again is that um, you really do want to do you want to get the best information that you possibly can. A CRE approach just makes good sense because it's context specific and it actually really you can spend some time trying to understand where your data is going and what it says that actually is appropriate for the situation. So I thank you. I don't know if there are any chat things there as well, but we'll get to those. So just some closing reflections. Let context guide the design. Use data as a dialogue, not the end all be all, but as a dialogue. And building reflection into every step. You do want to interrogate at every step of the way, are these the right questions for the situation that we're in? Is this the right design? Do we have the right people at the table? Um, is the way that we're looking at the data, does that make sense? Is that credible? Are people buying it? How can we best disseminate information? If we disseminate it this way, what audiences are we actually going to get to? So those are things that we have to continually think about as we go through the entire process. So some references and resources. I definitely want to draw your attention if you didn't see it the last time. The eval matrix actually is a tool that we developed funded by the Annie E. Casey Foundation that really lays out all the CRE perspectives and anything that has to do with people-centered evaluation and all the literature, including conversations about data collection, analyzing data, the theoretical foundation. So just wanted to point that out as we go. And thank you, questions and comments. I look forward to them. And thank you so much for the opportunity to present.
So thank you, Dr. Bledsoe. So I'm looking at some of the comments here, but I also know that we had some comments and questions from last week. As people come and start thinking up their questions, do you have kind of responses to them? So let me see. From last week, we had, let's see. Uh,
I think we have one from last week that I saw.
Yes, something, so one is from Bonnie, and mentions like, I just started using the University Belongingness Scale, the UBQ that was developed by Slatton et al. In 2018 that I like. I think I heard about this initially from one of the STEM meetings. If you have any ideas regarding what questions and topics to ask regarding framing the right questions would be great.
Yeah, it's been a while since I've worked with that scale actually, so I don't really have access to it. But I would probably say if you're looking at things that are belongingness, if there's a way that you can sort of situate them within the community that you're working with, like reframe. I usually like to reframe the question, the actual question that they have, see if it fits in the situation that I'm in. Like if it's an STEM, I will ask it with STEM students, something of that nature. Or do STEM students think of that way? That's the way I would usually reframe when I adapt. So I don't know if that helps. Again, I haven't been much in that space, but I start with that context and I ask with that context. That's my question that I'm always asking.
So, some of the comments here I see from Marilyn and also Kavita is responding to it is that, by the time we get to evaluation, it's evaluation and the research questions already are set. The funding has been set. So we can't change evaluations and although they can sort of influence how they're measured. Can you elaborate a little bit more about when we talk about iteration and tweaking and how we can take advantage of the CRE framework and practices to get at that? I know you mentioned it a little bit with the case study with HBCU, but can you elaborate a little bit more on some of those things?
Yeah, I think, so many times, much of what, not all, but I would say a good, 2/3 of when I've come in that the questions are already set. Um, and usually what I try to do in that space, and I'll be frank, mostly when people hire me, they know what they're getting. So so that's one thing. But that said, usually what it is that I like to continually update as data comes in. And so that means you're doing a little bit more work in terms of, like, instead of just bringing all the data in, you're doing it as you go along so that you can see um, how that might change the questions. I have, by doing that though, it allows me to and the team to sort of talk with the funder on a regular basis, or the programs folks on a regular basis on, hey, is there, I know you asked this question. Um, have you thought about asking this other question? And I've also asked, how important is this question to you? That you need to that needs to be answered right now, given that if you keep answering the same question, you might not, you're only going to get part of the story. Kavita, you have a question in between?
No, just a comment. So please finish, Katrina. Yeah.
No, go ahead.
No, so my approach to that question, I think it was Marilyn or Sarah who asked the question, is we are kind of saying that try to embed CRE upfront if you have an opportunity, right? For instance, what we do for evaluators in the evaluation section, which is, usually we get a page or half a page if we are lucky. Right. And we are asked to write the framework. And what we do is we end up writing utilization focused evaluation, just out of the can. That's the most commonly used or participatory research, but not understanding exactly that there's so many other frameworks. So I'm encouraging that if you have an opportunity as an evaluator for the STEM proposals, when you're asked to write the evaluation plan, think that preempted and then start writing at, at the get-go.
Yeah, that's even better. I know that there are a lot of times you don't get that. Sometimes you've been,
Exactly. You inherit some of, most of the
yeah,
sometimes you just inherit the
yeah,
evaluation
you kind
after.
of get it, and you're just like, oh, okay. And then somebody's really, really wedded to that question, and you're like, okay, all right, well,
Exactly.
let's start out with that question, and then, but that's where the continued iteration of like, hey, we just got some new data. There's been some interesting
Right.
developments.
Right.
Let's have
For
a,
instance, in one of the projects, Katrina, we are seeing if the PI is extremely interested in dissemination of the results, and they said, "What can we do now?" Right. So
yeah.
we're like, "Let's use photo voice," and they absolutely jumped at the idea. They said, "Yes, let's engage as scholars to collect the data because here we have participated research and we have photo voice." So now they are looking into that aspect, and then we are developing the framework to do photo voice after the fact. Yeah, but still, yep.
Yeah. Yeah. It's I mean, and that's a really good point, because there are things that you can come in and you can build in
Yeah.
at, at the back end. You can kind of say, because usually when you come in, and sometimes people, they're just not sure anyway.
Yeah.
And so you can make some suggestion. You're like, well, okay, listen, we can do this. How about we do this instead of this? And that will give us just a little bit more information. And usually when I do reports as well, I always have a question of, like, a section that says further questions,
Yeah.
questions that we did not answer, that we really wanted to answer. And some that has resulted sometimes where people are like, well, wait a minute. Let's back up and answer that question if we can.
Yeah. Thank you. Yep. Great.
Miranda, I see your hand up.
Oh, you're mute, Miranda. Do you unmute yourself?
Oops.
Okay, there we go. I had something pop up that kept saying that I wasn't able to unmute myself. I'm like, okay, that's fine. I can type this. I just wanted to ask, Katrina, have you ever experienced like struggle with the budget around kind of CRE? And because there's a lot of qualitative pieces, really rich that complement the quant, but they often take longer. And so, like, how do you navigate those conversations about like, and trying to choose like kind of the best pieces and of data collection and kind of those, especially those kind of the needs assessment almost, where you initially have those information interviews. Like a lot of it does take, of course, more time, but I think it's very valuable. But can people, pay for that time, pay for your time in those? I'm just trying to figure out how best to navigate not only conversations around that, but also as you, as an evaluator, kind of decide what best to do around maybe a set budget.
Yeah, one of the things that I started to love that started to happen maybe about 8 or 9 years ago is people started to do sort of like a tiny little planning budget, where I was like, oh, I love that, because that gave that gives a little bit more time. You can do some preliminary data collection to feel, and I always called it to like figure out what's going to be considered credible and valid, and what do we sink our teeth into. Because you do, at times you may have to ask people, and I've done this before, is what's most important? What do you need to, what data do you need now to make that important? That's actually going to get you where you need to be, and really center community voice. Sometimes people say, "Oh no, the survey will do," and then I try to do some kind of influence, of which case I try to say, are you sure it's survey data? Because I don't know what that's going to tell you. It's not going to really give you a voice or anything of that nature. But I have asked people, and Kavita, you might have an also another perspective on that as well. But I do ask people, at some point you're going to have to make, if you have a set budget, you have to decide what you value most, and what's really going to get you where you're going to be. And then the next thing, what evidence is most credible that's going to allow you to answer the question. So that's probably the first question, is like, what evidence is there? Okay, well, hey, if we they really want to hear participant stories and things of that nature, then you're probably going to spend a little bit more time. You're not going to be doing that survey the way you thought you were going to be doing it. Or if you are, you might throw a few extra dollars towards that photo voice to get that. But you have to ask, what's the question, and what's the most credible evidence that's going to sway people, and that usually helps them make a decision about the the method, and then whether or not they're going to put some money behind that method as well.
Or, as I said, I just gave you the example in the latter years of the STEM, where you are really thinking about the dissemination process, and the PI and the co-PIs are also interested and invested in it. That's when you say, okay, wait a minute, let's maybe reduce the surveys and then jump into this methodology and see what sticks, because we are really looking into publishing something. For STEM wise, those people who do have experience with the STEM, you would know that track 3 and the hubs, they have more money set aside, dedicated for research and evaluation. So I would say, upfront these costs, because you know that these things are coming expected, and you are actually expected to do some real good dissemination, which means that high quality research papers and, white papers, concept papers. So you have to kind of preempt and start thinking ahead, that what can we do so that it's very high quality research and evaluation.
And that's the best case scenario, is that really what you really want people to do is think ahead. You don't want them to be reactive.
Right.
Because honestly, if they're reactive, what kind of data is that? I mean, you can get all sorts of data, but I mean, really, is it going to be that good? And what are you really doing that? If you're just going to take any data, then what are you really looking at here?
Exactly.
Amy.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks for this opportunity. It's just been a fantastic presentation, both sections. I have a difficult question. I'm usually that person. So one of the things that I learn the most from is people who are disengaged. And of course, it's the hardest possible thing to collect their information. But for the folks who are leaving, transferring, dropping out, not coming to things, do you have any suggestions for best practices to help find out what didn't work for them, so that we can build it into things next time or make changes or improvements?
We chased them down, Amy. Okay, then now back to Katrina.
Just to say, we kind of do. There's some that I mean, to some degree, we've kept in touch with folks. And this has just been my own experience with that, because it's really tough, because it's great when everybody, hey, it's great, it's going really well. But we do try to. I learned probably about 10 years ago about maybe a little longer, but about trying to keep up with everybody, like as much as you can, and including those people who dropped out. And usually when they dropped out, if we could immediately, we tried to like contact them immediately, even if they couldn't, even if they weren't going to, keep in touch with us regularly. Oh, we heard that you're taking some time off or something of that nature. Oh, can you tell us what some of your experience was? But and again, as Kavita is saying as well, Exit interviewing is a big deal of trying to do that. So at least you have that. You may get it in the moment. Sometimes we've done, exit interviewing where we've waited like 3 months and then we try to contact. Again, you've got a smaller N, but you may have some folks who have said, the first time we got an exit interview that we did, people were, generally just kind of, upset. And then 3 months later, they had they had a different perspective, on it, and that was really helpful. So I just think that I mean, to sort of like, I know this sounds bad, but kind of chasing them down, like, oh, hello, yeah, there's something to that. And I think that really, and I'm just going to say this because I know we're about to close down, but the one thing about the whole process, and I wouldn't say this for CRE, I would just say this in general for evaluation, is that it is a highly engaging process. It's not transactional, but we've treated it pretty transactional. So that's why there's sort of like a one and done kind of thing. But if you're really going to get the kind of information that's going to either make change, enhance change, or whatever, it has to be some level of continued connection with folks. And that requires, being pretty present as well. And that even as I say that, I think about, I wasn't taught that way. So but I mean, that's a key piece to this as well.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Bledsoe. So we will move on now to to our rest of our slides.
Oops, let me get the slide back up here. Oh, you got them.
Okay, Jamila's got them. So
Yeah.
thank you, Jamila. So if you have any questions after this webinar and would like to request a quick consult with M&A, so as you can see, we've got some experience with applying CRE in our work. Or if you have STEM project evaluation or research questions in general, please go ahead, either use this QR code or click to the link, and you can reach us from that venue. Next slide, please. All right, so we encourage everyone to check out the resource page of the RAC website. There are new additions to the evidence-based practices, or EBPs, repositories, which address practices such as tutoring, faculty interactions outside the classroom, field trips, let's see here, social emotional learning, and mental health services. So in addition, there is a new deep dive report on identifying and selecting STEM scholars, so please check that out. And for those who are planning for applying for the next round of STEM grants, we also have the popular guidebook for preparing research and evaluation plans that you see there. And it's also available for download. Now, just want to also let you know that we're going to take a pause for our evaluation TA webinar series in December. And what we're going to do is we're going to switch over and prepare for the next round of STEM proposal solicitations, at which time M&A will provide a series of webinars to help prospective PIs, co-PIs, evaluators, researchers, and grantee teams to prepare their plans for evaluation and research studies that are in accordance with the proposed projects, as well as with the requirements of STEM projects. So stay tuned for those sets of webinars for preparing for your proposals, if you are planning to do so. And then after the submission deadline, we'll resume working on these topic-oriented evaluation TA webinars. Next slide, please. So here's a link to the participant survey. We couldn't do all our webinars without your feedback, so please, please, please complete our survey. Next slide, please. And though we're going to be, as I said, switching over, we still want to stay connected with you. And so here are ways you can reach us through our website, newsletter, and social media. Again, thank you so much for participating and completing the survey. And thank you, Dr. Bledsoe, for leading us in this, wonderful two-part series on CRE. And thank you all for your insights from your own experience and your questions and just conversation. Really want to develop this community of practice as we move further to the next year. So with that, any other have last minute comments or questions?
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.